I worked just shy of 40 years, but my pension still wasn't going to be enough for us. So when he called out of the blue, offering a free pension review, I was all ears. He spoke professionally about investments. He seemed a really decent guy. Just shy of 40 years pension. He took all of it.
It is 16:37, 4:37, 23 minutes to 5. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV and on radio. Talk today that hundreds of British soldiers may soon be flown to bases in Eastern Europe. Countries like Estonia are nervous about what they see as an appetite in Moscow for conquest. But Estonia is a member of NATO, as are we, and that means we are obliged by treaty to defend Estonia and other Eastern European states from invasion. But Ukraine, which many people think Russia is poised to invade, is not in NATO. So, should we risk being dragged into conflict with a nuclear-armed power over a country we have no legal obligation to protect? Well, here in the studio, as you know, is Peter Hitchens, and Director of Communications at the Henry Jackson Society, Sam Armstrong, joins us now. As you see. Sam, you're just joining us, so we'll let you kick this one off. We're under no legal treaty obligation to back Ukraine. There's talk of soldiers and airmen being scrambled to Eastern Europe. Some people will look at this conflict, say it's 1,500 miles away as the crow flies, nothing to do with us.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right to say there's no legal obligation, but there is a moral obligation. In 1994, Ukraine had the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. That meant that no country could have invaded it because, had it done so, its cities would have been detonated off the face of the earth. We wanted Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, so in a series of negotiations, we got it to do so. In exchange, we signed an agreement called the Budapest Memorandums alongside the US and Russia as well, that said we will do whatever it takes to assure Ukraine's territorial integrity. That agreement has not been torn up, it has not been cancelled, it is not legally binding, but it is, in my opinion, a morally compelling document or grounds for us to defend Ukraine. Today, that is being called into check. And we're not talking about sending in tanks or troops or artillery to really fight in the front line. We're talking about doing the minimum possible. And to my mind, if we are a country of our words, if we are not what our sometimes foes call us, perfidious Albion, then sending in some sort of support is the very least we can do.
Peter Hitchens, we have sent scores of anti-tank weapons. It's entirely possible that in coming weeks, some of those weapons will be used to eviscerate Russian soldiers inside tanks and armoured personnel carriers. Is that a good idea? Is that something we should have done?
Well, I hope that won't happen. And I want to question here the constant drumbeat of suggestions that this is going to happen. Where does this idea come from, that there is going to be an invasion of Ukraine? Vladimir Putin has many faults. He's a sinister tyrant. His country is a corrupt, lawless mess, but he hasn't shown any signs of being stark staring mad. And I don't think that a military invasion of Ukraine by Russia would do anything other than destroy him and quite possibly tear Russia to pieces. You don't, in these times, invade other countries with tanks. This is the only country which is allowed to go around aggressively invading other countries is the United States. Nobody else can do it or get away with it, and the consequences of it would be disastrous. I think what we need to really discuss is why on earth we're in this extraordinary state of tension with Russia, and what on earth it's all for. The whole business of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was hugely opposed by very important people, including George Kennan, actually the architect of the Cold War, came out of retirement in the 1990s to beg the United States not to do this. The people who we supposedly respect in Russian politics, the prominent liberal Yegor Gaidar, became so alarmed by it that in 2004 he called in the Canadian ambassador, who was a friend, and begged him to tell his government to stop the expansion of NATO eastwards because it was going to cause nothing but trouble. Nobody heeded this, and nobody heeded Putin himself when he made his speech, I think, in Munich in 2007, saying, "Why are you doing this? What's all this aimed against? What is the purpose of this expansion? Can we keep all these promises that we make? Britain has not been a country of its word. We let down Denmark in the 1860s. We let down Poland in 1939. And it's absolutely not true to say that we have been a country, or what we've often done, in fact, is make promises on the continent of Europe that we can't keep, and as a result have raised tensions which never needed to be raised.
Sam, just on that point about the early 1990s, the Soviet Empire had collapsed. Parts of Moscow, other parts of Russia had become kind of Wild West. It had become a pretty lawless, almost anarchic place. Do you think that was the moment when the NATO alliance, the Western alliance, maybe overplayed its hand and created the conditions for resentment to fester? Because if you listen to Vladimir Putin, he gave an extraordinary interview recently when he confessed to being, I mean, it's scarcely believable, a taxi driver briefly in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union was collapsing. But what he communicated really strongly was that sense that you in the West took advantage of us at our moment of weakness. And I just wonder, Peter Hitchens makes the point that we overreached at that point. We took too much, and we've created resentment that's still there.
No, not really, not at all, actually. Peter Hitchens' argument is basically that, well, we should have asked for permission or some sort of assent before we allowed NATO to expand into, well, it hasn't expanded into Ukraine at all, but into the Baltic states and bordering on Russia. That's like saying that Canada, before Canada enters into any agreement with Russia, it ought to seek the US's permission. That's balderdash. And Peter Hitchens more broadly says, well, what evidence is there that any invasion is coming into Ukraine? Well, I'll tell you what invasion there is. Russia is already in Ukraine. It is in Crimea, that is Ukraine's sovereign territory. It is in the eastern parts, quote-unquote militias, which are really just Russian forces, are already in Ukraine today. Putin takes what he can get away with. It is based on a racist idea that Russian-speaking people, wherever they are, must be governed by the Russian nation.
Well, Sam, with respect, Sam, I spent a few weeks in Ukraine in Donbass province in 2014 and walked amongst marches on demonstrations in cities like Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, where Russian speakers felt ethnically Russian and they felt that they wanted to be part of Russia. So I take what you're saying. Peter Hitchens was disagreeing vigorously at one stage about something.
So I just didn't say anything about asking permission. I said that from our own point of view, from the point of view of the Western countries at the end of the Cold War, the expansion of NATO was a mistake. It didn't matter about whether anybody asked permission. And if George Kennan thinks it's a mistake, and I trust you've heard of him, if George Kennan thinks it's a mistake, I think it's a mistake. And we constantly claim to be in favour of Russian liberals. If people like Yegor Gaidar, who was one of the most prominent Russian liberals, said this is a mistake, why don't we actually listen to them? What he was warning against was precisely what we have, which is the increase in Russian nationalism and transigence, which has resulted from this. And I think that we have to recognise it was a mistaken policy. And if you go right back to the beginning of it, huge numbers of people. Once upon a time, even the London Times was against it when it was still a sensible newspaper. All kinds of people were against it at the time. And now we have this position where we have a confrontation which has largely been created by our own efforts. What happened in Ukraine in 2014 was a very huge diplomatic effort to shift Ukraine from being non-aligned between Russia and the NATO countries into being an aligned country, because the association agreement, which it eventually made with the EU, contains political and military clauses, and you can't expect the Russians to be unmoved by this event, especially given the threats that Ukrainian leaders had made to, for instance, their ability to continue to use Sevastopol. So they were very worried about that. So the aggression in this actually came, as the whole NATO expansion came, from the Western end, not from the Russian end. And there is in existence an agreement called Minsk II, which offers serious ways out of this, particularly a federal Ukraine in which the Russian speakers finally get something approaching the sort of internal self-government which they want. Ukraine retains its integrity, and there is actual peace. Now, I'm not going to go into arguments about who has or has not been keenest on avoiding this agreement, but the fact is that agreement exists, is there to be enforced. I've seen very little sign among the supposedly responsible statesmen of the West of anybody trying to get that agreement revived and enforced and implemented. If you want peace in the Ukraine, and anybody who likes Ukrainians surely does want peace in Ukraine because war is hell, then that should be the avenue you're pursuing, not talking up invasions and talking up tension and demanding NATO expansion, which has been, since it began, a disaster for everybody involved, and something, I have to say, on the record, we promised not to do. Over and over again, the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. has an archive of all the points at which we said we would not do it, and then we did it. OK. Sam, we'll give you a bit of time to reply to a lot of that. And maybe just address this idea too. Let's assume the worst. Let's assume it comes to shooting in Ukraine. What do we say to those people who say if the West doesn't do something robust at that stage, it's really showing the green light to other actors, most obviously the Chinese, and almost encouraging them to walk into Taiwan?
Well, it would be, and it has. That's how we responded in Georgia. That's how we responded in Crimea. And the West, given any opportunity, continues to do the very least it can in order to satisfy the agreements that it feels it is bound by. The one person that we haven't spoken about, the one group of people we haven't spoken about, are the people of Eastern Europe. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, did not get compelled to join NATO. They asked to. Ukraine is begging and pleading to join NATO. We haven't forced it to. These are countries that are trying to choose a sovereign decision in exactly the same way that Taiwan is trying to choose to be a free and democratic country. There are those to which that is offensive. President Xi and President Putin. Our job in the West as the inheritors of freedom is to defend it and fight for it. Nothing comes for free, and certainly freedom isn't free. And if we want to defend it, if we mean what we say, when we claim that we are democratic, free, leading nations of the world, we fight for those that are trying to make the choice for themselves to be democratic, self-governing, and prosperous people who mean to do nothing but trade with us and help us prosper here too in the West.
Peter, sorry, go on, Peter.
Well, I was in Vilnius in January of 1992, January 1991, when the Soviet Union went mad. And I was also around later on when the Baltic states gained their independence from Moscow in 1991. They didn't join NATO until 13 years later. And during those 13 years, I don't think there's any record of Russia having menaced them or threatened them with invasion or anything else. Also, the idea that these countries joined NATO and they just came and said, we want to join NATO, is so oversimplified. The whole decision to expand NATO and to offer membership to such countries was taken in Washington, D.C., and it was taken after an immensely powerful lobbying campaign, mainly by arms manufacturers, who spent, I think, $51 million to secure that vote for NATO expansion to be allowed. That was what, and a country that, when it joins NATO, is committed to extraordinarily strong defence appropriations. It has to spend money on defence, which none of these countries have. So what do you think is actually going on here? They couldn't have joined NATO unless the United States had decided to let them, and they couldn't have been effective members of NATO unless they'd been equipped and bought equipment which they couldn't afford. This isn't a simple matter of people saying, oh, we'd love to join NATO. They joined NATO because they were encouraged to do so. They were encouraged to do so by the United States. And it's ridiculous to pretend this is some kind of, oh, they wanted to join. For many years, they were not permitted to join, as you also know.
Sam Armstrong, 15 seconds if you can.
Well, they may have been encouraged to join, but they did do so. They chose to join. People in Ukraine, people in Estonia, people wherever else are just like us. They've got the ability to choose for themselves. We should defend their choices, and to pretend that their choices are any less worthy than ours is morally bankrupt, and I'm afraid to say a slightly xenophobic approach on looking at people around the world.
Well, that's a charge which Peter Hitchens will get to address after the break.
Thank you.
But Sam Armstrong and Peter Hitchens, thanks both very much indeed for your thoughts there. Coming up after the break at 9 minutes to the hour, we're going to be joined by an NHS doctor to discuss COVID super immunity. But first, it's time for the weather.